Hello and welcome to another episode of our Brothers Creed podcast where we talk about motivation, experiences, and exploring the world around us. We are the Thomas Brothers, and I am Jared.
And I'm Ethan. And today's episode, we're going to talk about presidential pardons. There's been quite a few presidents since the beginning of the United States of America, and each one of those presidents has, in some way, shape, or form, pardoned somebody who was in need of that pardon, who has done some sort of criminal act, or who was under suspicion, or in prison, or going to prison, and the president at the time felt necessary to intervene, sometimes for good reasons.
Sometimes for the welfare of the American people, sometimes for the
for
welfare
personal
themselves. Sometimes for like the most minuscule of things. Like I think I saw one, it was like, I'm trying to remember what it was, but it was like the guy did something so minuscule. It was like it was like he stole like something out of a convenience store or something like that. And it was like in 1990. No. It was he turned the odometer back on a car in 1989. And he had been serving in prison for who knows how long. And so the president pardoned him.
Yeah.
So sometimes there's just like stupid laws. The president can say, okay, you can.
Yeah, that guy got railroaded, right?
Yeah.
I mean, he shouldn't be sitting in jail 10 years later for something.
Changing an odometer back.
Or whatever else. And so we have a bunch of, we're going to kind of talk about the history a little bit. We're going to talk about some of the presidents throughout history and how many people they have pardoned and what reasons. And then we're going to go through and share some specific examples of some interesting stories of pardons that have happened in the United States.
Yeah, let's go ahead and dive in.
All right.
Spartans! What is your profession?
Any man who must say, I am the king, is no true king.
What I do have are a very particular set of skills. Skills that make me a nightmare.
If I can change, and you can change, everybody can change!
Let us all unite! Let us fight for a new world, a decent world.
So when we're talking about the concept of pardoning someone, this concept goes back a long ways, all the way back to the mid-1700s BC, that is. You don't hear much from that era. So the ancient code of, I'm probably going to butcher this, but it's Hammurabi from Babylon. It's kind of like Harambe, isn't that the girl that got shot?
Yeah, I don't think it's the same thing, but yeah.
So
close. Similar
similar to that. So it said in that code, if a man's wife be surprised with another man, or she gets basically caught in adultery, both shall be tied and thrown into the water. But the husband may pardon his wife, and the king his slaves. So, and that was one of the things in this, and it's interesting. The reason why they have this is because it was like carved into this like marble like pillar, tablet. It was kind of it was just a big. It's like a cylinder type thing, and all these rules are etched around it because apparently they were posted around the city so people could know the rules, right? So that there's this concept of like pardoning, and we talk about the founders of our country, United States of America. There was a lot of debate over whether to include a presidential pardon or not. Alexander Hamilton was for it, and George Mason of Virginia, he was representative for Virginia, was against it. Hamilton eventually prevailed in the argument, and there were that there are times. His argument was that there are times when the welfare of the government requires it, so that it could move forward. And so pardons are typically done for one of two reasons, ideally. For what the founders of our country had in mind was one, the public welfare. So say, hey, as a country, we need to move past this, and we're going to talk about a couple of those examples. And then for the other one was mercy. So somebody serving years and years in prison for changing an odometer on a car back and then trying to sell it, that's dishonest, but maybe a little bit of mercy is given. So presidential pardons can only apply actually to federal criminal issues. People who are in trouble with the state need to be pardoned by the governor. So Only if you, and it's not civil, only criminal cases that are against you. There's actually a formal procedure to request a presidential pardon. You can send a request to the Department of Justice, and then they'll pass it on to the president, which is the office of the president. However, in recent years, that's not really how it works anymore. It's just kind of like, if you're connected well enough, you might get it. The Supreme Court can do nothing about it. Congress can do nothing about it. And so it's kind of a special, unique privilege only that the executive branch has. So you might be thinking, well, where does this come from? It comes from Article 2, Section 2, Clause 1 of the Constitution of the United States of America. And it says that the President of the United States, quote, shall have power to grant reprieves and pardons for offenses against the United States, except in cases of impeachment. Presidential pardons, there are two things you'll typically hear about as presidential pardons and commutations. So a pardon is a complete forgiveness of a crime, and it restores full rights of citizenship. People who have been convicted of a crime forfeit certain rights, say the right to vote or hold public office, but because a pardon wipes that out, those rights are then restored. So it's almost like a pardon. This is what someone had said about it. A pardon reaches both the punishment prescribed for the offense and the guilt of the offender. And when the pardon is full, it releases the punishment and blots out the existence, the guilt, out of existence the guilt, so that in the eyes of the law, the offender is innocent as if he had never committed the offense. So if you think about it almost in like a
interesting
religious way, it's like if God, saves you, it's almost as if you've never done it.
Shall remember it no more.
Yeah, exactly. Your sins shall be remembered no more. Although they be red as scarlet, they'll be white as snow, right?
Yeah.
So in the early days of the pardon, it was assumed that the power included the power to pardon specific classes and communities in mass. And we'll talk about some of those examples in a few minutes. So then there's the second part, which is a commutation. So this reduces or deletes the sentence, but keeps the conviction. This person does not have any rights restored because the conviction stays on the record. So the U.S. Now this part's a little bit different. It's had to be interpreted by the Supreme Court because, as I read earlier from the Constitution, it doesn't really talk about commutations specifically. So this is what the Supreme Court has said about that. They've interpreted the language in Article 2 of the Constitution to include the power to grant many different forms of clemency, generally less sweeping than a full pardon, including not only pardons but also conditional pardons, commutations of sentence, conditional commutations of sentences, remission of fines, forfeitures, and other criminal financial penalties, respites and reprieves and amnesties. So, it kind of expanded that a little bit more to what that means. And so that's any questions? That's kind of the history of pardons.
Yeah, interesting. So a pardon is like, it's complete forgiveness, and a commutation is more of like a reduction of a sentence.
Yeah, it's like you're done. Like, there was like, so it's like you're done.
You get 40 years.
5 years. You serve 5 years of your 20 years in prison for changing the odometer back. You're done.
Good. Yeah,
you're done. You still did it. We still acknowledge that you did it, but you're done.
Yeah.
I think there was a lady with, I don't know her name, but when Trump was in office, and she had some kind of minor marijuana charge, and she had been in prison for like 15 years.
I think it was an African American lady
and he commuted her sentence and said, hey, we shouldn't have people in jail for 15, 20 years who have for a minor possession
marijuana
charges.
Possession that was 10 years ago.
Yeah. So that's the kind of that's that mercy part that they talk about, and that's a commutation of her sentence.
Yeah, I've always kind of thought it was interesting that sometimes the laws change, and it's like for example, marijuana laws in the 70s or 80s are different than marijuana laws now, and so it's like you could have people still in prison from the 80s or the 90s that they're still in prison today for issues with certain things that maybe today would not even be that big of a deal.
Yeah, depending on the state you're in.
Yeah, and so it's kind of like, I've always thought, well, then should they go back and should they say, okay, well, this is I mean, they broke the law when it was the law back then, but now the law has been changed. So should they like re-review those sentences and be like, okay, well, the law has changed.
I think so.
I think they should.
I think so. I mean, our laws are not written in stone, and like,
I think
if they're changing a law, and then like, and they go back and say, okay, well, maybe these people who were demons the minute before, but then after we pass a law, now they're okay. We have to revise.
Yeah.
So.
I think that's interesting. So, so there have been approximately 20,000 presidential pardons and commutations in the history of the United States. And this goes all the way back to George Washington, right? All the way up to Joe Biden.
What do you want to tell Joe Biden right now?
Joe Byron.
What's up, baby? Take me out to dinner.
So I'm just going to kind of walk through some of the big hitters, let's say. I'm not going to go through every single president of the United States and how many people that they pardoned. But this little factoid to start out with, from George Washington all the way until Grover Cleveland, who was in office in 1889, all pardons were handwritten by the President of the United States. They were all handwritten, personalized. After Grover Cleveland, it got to a point to where the pardons were prepared for the president by the administration, and then the president just had to sign them. So I thought that was kind of interesting. Again, like a specific, like a written pardon letter, handwritten letter from the president of the United States.
Yeah.
All the way up until the late 1800s. I mean, I guess that kind of makes sense because they didn't really have like printers and stuff, but or emails.
So they had to write it anyway.
I mean, there was printers.
They could have had a secretary write it,
there was printers, but it wasn't as prevalent as today. So I thought that was kind of interesting. So starting with George Washington. So in this number that I'm going to share, this is combinations of pardons and commutations. So it's both of them. So he either pardoned the person or reduced their sentence in one form or another. So George Washington had 16. Thomas Jefferson, and these are in order, but obviously I'm skipping some presidents between the few. So Thomas Jefferson had 119. Andrew Jackson had 386. Abraham Lincoln had 384. The president after Abraham Lincoln was Andrew Johnson. Obviously, we know Abraham Lincoln was the president through the Civil War, right? So the next president was Andrew Johnson, and he pardoned 654 people. But that does not include the thousands of pardons for ex-Confederate soldiers that he pardoned as well. So I guess in an effort to reunify the country after the Civil War, President Andrew Johnson offered a pardon to all ex-Confederate troops that were willing to verbally pledge their allegiance to the United States government.
Yeah.
And so that was kind of interesting. I thought that it was kind of like a mass pardoning, right?
Yeah, well, some people that didn't pardon. I was actually that piece right there was a major kind of that was a major happening with the presidential pardons, because at the time a lot of people in the Union, or the United States, I guess, because it was no longer the Union, they were like, well, we can't have. They were saying the argument was a presidential pardon can't absolve someone from being a Confederate, because they said, well, you can't hold public office if you were previously a Confederate.
Yeah,
and that wasn't necessarily a rule, but there's that's not the kind of character to people that we want to have in public office.
Yeah. Well, so that goes into the next one here. So that was Andrew Johnson, but the next president of the United States was Ulysses S Grant, who was the main general for the Union Army during the Civil War. Mm-hmm. So he was the next president, and he pardoned 1,332 people. But one thing that he did is that he actually solved that issue that you were talking about. So he pardoned all but 500 former top Confederate leaders when he signed something called the Amnesty Act of 1872. I guess there were some certain stipulations that like 500 of the higher up people of the Confederate Army did not qualify for this Amnesty Act, but everyone else that was involved in the Confederacy was pardoned. And so the Amnesty Act of 1872 reversed most of the penalties that were imposed on former Confederate soldiers by the 14th Amendment. So Section 3 of the 14th Amendment prohibited the election or appointment to any federal or state office of any person who held any certain offices and then engaged in insurrection, rebellion, or treason. So basically, anyone who was a member of the Confederate States of America in any form could not apply or could not hold any federal or state office. And so anyone who's going to be in the government basically is going to be all people represented that were, there's going to be no representation from the what was the Confederate States of America.
I just put something together in my mind. I read an article today that, that guy, the senator, his name is Cawthorn, he's in a wheelchair.
Yeah.
So they're trying to say that he is in breach of that 14th Amendment because he opposed the certification of the election results, and that was what they consider, some consider treason.
Yeah.
And so therefore he should not hold public office.
Yeah. Well, and the thing is, too, is that it specifically stated in there, insurrection, right?
Yeah.
And that's the word that gets thrown around on this January 6th, the insurrection. Or what is that one Democrat? That's the guy who was talking about it. And the erection. I mean, insurrection. Okay. He said that like on the Senate floor.
Really?
Yeah. And he's like corrected himself, was like, oh, geez. Yeah, so this whole insurrection thing. Oh, if anybody supported this insurrection on the Capitol on January 6th and all this other kind of stuff, they shouldn't hold office. Well, they quote this. But, and I actually didn't pull up the third section of the 14th Amendment. I don't know if it still states this same thing. And I don't know, I guess the Amnesty Act kind of 1872 reversed that for specifically Confederate soldiers. So maybe it is still in there.
But it was just a presidential pardon.
Presidential pardon allowed for the
Confederates.
Confederate soldiers. So I thought that was really interesting.
And that's part of what the presidential pardons are for, is to help the country move forward.
Yeah. Well, and I think that really was a truly great thing, because then we had separation in the states, but there was need for unification after the Civil War, and there was tons of animosity.
Oh yeah.
I mean, we talked about our, Hatfields and McCoy's episode. There was, the whole thing started off between animosity between a former Union soldier and then the Confederate soldiers.
Yeah. So to keep that, to keep these, to have all these southern states in the Union and say, well, you can't even
hold
representatives from your area can't hold office anymore, then it's like, well, I guess we'll just rebel again, It's just like, well, you got to make some peace and some concessions.
Yeah, yeah. And so I just thought it was interesting, too, that it was Ulysses S. Grant who kind of saw that and did it after Andrew Johnson, who was after the Abraham Lincoln as well. So interesting fact there. The next one was Grover Cleveland with 1,107. Woodrow Wilson, 2,480. Herbert Hoover, the vacuum guy. Home Alone reference. 1,385. Franklin D. Roosevelt. He has the most listed on the list, the highest of all presidents. I guess it depends on how you look at it, but there was probably more than 3,000. So it's 3,687. Ulysses S. Grant probably pardoned more people than 3,000 with his blanket mass Confederate pardon.
But these were
specifically FDR 3,687. So that's quite a few.
Yeah.
The next one was Jimmy Carter. He pardoned 566 people, but actually he ended up pardoning more than that.
Yeah, so I had looked into that one. In 1977, he offered a blanket pardon to Vietnam War draft dodgers during his first full day in office. So this is most of the time these pardons just get dumped like the last day in office. But basically this allowed thousands of young men to return to U.S. from Canada and other countries that they had fled because they didn't want to go to Vietnam. So it was kind of a controversial move.
I wonder if that was one of his campaign points. I wonder if he said he was going to do that.
Must have been.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's really interesting. I think that's, I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, he's a President Gerald Ford in 1974 offered conditional amnesty to troops who deserted during the war, a more serious crime that could result in death penalty if they worked 2 years in a public service job.
Yeah.
So that was a conditional pardon.
For deserters of war.
For deserters. And this, these people are who just dodged the draft. I think in hindsight, it's very hard to say. In hindsight, looking back at Vietnam, and I'm not a Vietnam expert, but I feel like the whole thing was just a total crapshoot, and we just basically failed, and we didn't really need to be there, and it was just total nonsense.
Yeah.
And then
I think the principle of dodging the draft is, I think that the principle of it is bad. Supporting your country is the right thing to do.
But if your country's doing the wrong thing, I think that's the question.
Yeah,
it's if you're dodging the draft because you don't want to go fight the Japanese when they're attacking Pearl Harbor, or fight the Germans, that's a little bit different. But when you're going to fight an enemy that doesn't really maybe pose that much of a threat to your own country,
was it maybe more of a political war than? I guess I don't know the in-depth reasons of Vietnam. I think it was pretty complex, but
yeah. Well, we're just going to save the Vietnam people from the Viet Cong, So
yeah,
I don't know. I think it's kind of a hard thing.
I think
it's one of those peace things,
I think inevitably it's a good thing that he did it.
It's just kind of a peace thing. It's like, hey, come back. You're still wanted in this country. Yeah. Maybe we made a mistake, with this whole Vietnam thing.
Well, and I think a lot of those people probably were, people that were able to contribute lots to society.
But there were people that did a lot of stuff to get out of the draft. I mean, I heard one story about a guy putting green Jello all over his body so that his body would turn all green. He showed up all sickly, and they're like, "Dude, you're denied."
You ain't going, yeah.
He's like, "Oh, thank you," and so.
Yeah, so I had here. I don't know if you said how many, but I think they said it was over around 200,000.
Yeah, but
they
imagine
were part of that party.
Imagine your son being called up to go, and then your neighbor is, their son. They are like, "Oh well, we're going to just leave the country because and." So there's this sense of duty, when duty calls. I can understand both sides.
I can imagine coming back, whenever he made that pardon, you have kind of an influx of people coming back, and you're like, oh, Jimmy, you're 26 years old, and I haven't seen you for the past 5 years. How
was Barbados?
Yeah, how was the moon? Right? It's just where have you been? I mean, I can understand how there potentially was some hostility.
Oh, it was good. Yeah, how's Timmy doing? Yeah, Timmy died in Vietnam. Oh, about that.
Yeah,
that's why I didn't go. I mean, that would be hard. But
that'd be hard.
I wonder how many people actually came back.
I don't know. So now it kind of got on to some of the, I'd say, more modern day-ish presidents.
We missed one that I had.
Okay, go ahead.
So in 1858, President Buchanan pardoned the Mormons. So for those of you who don't know, the Mormons were a religious group of people that were kind of persecuted in the mid 1800s, and they eventually made their way west on the Mormon Trail, which is rightly named, to Salt Lake City.
Settled in Utah.
And when they were in Utah, which at the time it wasn't Utah, it was just it was actually in Mexico, and there was some disputes with the Mormons. They had been persecuted this whole way, and basically they went west to escape this persecution. And there was the Mountain Meadows Massacre, where a group of settlers somehow got in a tough with some of the members of the church that lived in that area, and they ended up just
had a gunfight. And a lot of people died.
And killed a bunch of these people, and so that is hotly debated about what exactly happened with that. But essentially, there was this kind of war between the U.S. and the Mormons. It wasn't like a hot war; it was kind of like a cold war. And the U.S. government sent out a bunch of troops at one point to Salt Lake to check out, see what was going on, and there was nothing going on. And
they were just living.
They actually, they were building a temple at the time, but they were afraid that the government would burn down the temple, so they buried it.
Yeah, they had. I think they had like all the foundation and everything
Yeah,
built.
they buried it, and then the government came and there was just a field there instead of a temple. And they're like, okay, well, it's fine. And then they left, and they actually discovered that in doing that the foundation was compromised and it had cracked, and so they had to pull out all the sandstone foundation and then replace with granite blocks. So interesting. But Buchanan's basically pardon said that he was offering to the inhabitants of Utah, who shall submit to the laws of a free pardon for the seditions and treasons herefore by them committed. So,
he just is kind of probably. I think a lot of these kind of a unification thing. It's just like, you know, it didn't.
Apparently, there was 100 migrants en route to California that were killed in the 1857 Mountain Meadows Massacre.
Yeah.
So, interesting. One of those mass pardons.
Yeah. So, looking at more modern day presidents, I went to George H.W. Bush. So, this is
Senior.
George W.'s dad. He pardoned 77 people. Bill Clinton, who I think we have a couple examples from him, he pardoned 459. George W. Bush pardoned 200. Barack Obama pardoned 1,927. Donald Trump pardoned 237. And Joe Biden...
all these are pardoned and committed.
Pardoned and committed.
Commutated.
However you say it.
Commutations, yeah.
Commutations, yeah. So pardons
commuted sentences.
Commuted sentences, yeah. Donald Trump was 237, and Joe Biden, I think, he's only been in office for a year at this time, so I think it's 0.
1,000 or so.
Yeah, like 10,000.
So
0.
One of the ones I gotta talk about, and you do this one too. So let me know what you think. So one of the Clinton pardons, and this is where I feel like we've gone seriously off the rails on a crazy train with some of these pardons, away from all these good feel good things of mercy and mass good for the country. Anybody who has listened to the show for any amount of episodes probably knows we're not a big fan of the Clintons. Anyway, this one guy, Mark Rich. Mark Rich was a fugitive billionaire who was, and he fled to Switzerland in 1983 after he was indicted for evading $48 million in taxes and buying $200 million of Iranian oil in violation of the U.S. embargo during the 1979 hostage crisis. So, tax evasion and embargo.
$50 million of tax evasion.
Yeah, and so he goes to Switzerland, and then in the year 2000, his wife his ex-wife actually, Denise Rich, she's like, oh, I want to rescue my ex-husband. So she
this is during the presidency of President Clinton.
Yeah, she gave $325,000 to the Democratic Party, as well as $100,000 to the Clinton Library. And then that was just that year. In total, she ended up giving over $1 million to the Democratic Party and over $450,000 to the Clinton Library. And so then
I saw too that she also donated $100,000 into Hillary Clinton's campaign to run for New York Senate as well.
Yeah, and then the presidential pardon.
And this was all happened. Yeah, all that came, and they said, "Oh, I think we'll pardon your husband."
Yeah. Oh well, he was a good guy.
He was a good guy. Yeah. He was just misunderstood.
Don't worry about the $48 million in tax evasion, and $200 million in Iranian oil that he shouldn't have. Oh, but basically bought from terrorists, right? They're terrorists.
Yeah.
And then the New York Times, which we know is not the most conservative of newspapers, called it, quote, a shocking abuse of presidential power, close quote.
Interesting.
So pretty interesting.
So I have another Bill Clinton story. And actually, to go along with the one you just said, that was done on his final day in office.
Yeah.
So that pardon happened on his final day in office. And this other one also happened on his last day.
That's when they stole the furniture out of the White House.
Yeah. So this also happened on his last day in office. So Bill Clinton, he pardoned his brother, his half brother, Roger Clinton Jr., who was his half brother, after he served a year in federal prison for cocaine possession and trafficking of cocaine. Right, so his brother served a year in prison for cocaine possession and trafficking of cocaine.
It was his brother-in-law.
Well, no, it was his half brother.
Okay,
so it was his brother.
Yeah.
It was his brother from another mother, maybe.
Yeah.
But he ended up on his last day in
office. It would be a
office.
brother from another father, technically.
Well, it could be.
Oh, wait.
Either way.
Yeah. Oh,
Either
yeah.
way. So, but the interesting thing was he only served a year in prison, but then he was out of prison and he went doing up all his other stuff. But he was having a lot of trouble, like because he had this whole massive stain on his record, and so Bill Clinton just basically pardoned him of all of these things so that it would completely be expunged from his record, so that he'd have a completely clean record. Did that the day before he left office.
That if he wouldn't have done that wouldn't have been for the good of the country. So
yeah,
I'm surprised they just didn't give him a job at the Clinton Foundation and just have him live a cush life.
He probably does, but
he probably does have a lot.
Actually, I think he was like an actor or something like that. He played and produced in like a bunch of movies or something, and
Oh,
these
really?
aren't like adult movies either. These are like actual movies. So I just thought it was interesting. But yeah, I mean, there's all kinds, and I think too. I mean, we were just talking about Bill Clinton specifically, just because that was one of the first ones. But I mean, I don't think it's particularly dependent upon party. That all of the Democrats are taking care of their own. The Republicans are worrying about the country. I don't think that's. I think both of them. I think there's probably some pardons that Bill Clinton did that were probably legitimate and that were needed. You know,
and there's obviously criticism on both sides. Trump pardoned several people. Roger Stone, who was indicted for several things. And Michael Flynn.
He pardoned some people around the whole Russia stuff, and which all ended up being a hoax anyway. So
yeah. So, but I think that what got those guys busted wasn't anything to do with Russia, because that was totally a lie.
It
was other personal stuff that they were doing.
It was other personal stuff, and a lot
Bannon,
of it was.
he also pardoned Bannon.
Yeah, a lot of it was perjury before the Senate or whatever else that they lied. Basically, they told lies under oath, and a lot of that was
Hillary Clinton has done that many times. and then we asked Comey, "Hey, what about the time when she lied under oath?" Oh, we weren't investigating that.
Wipe with a cloth?
Yeah, you mean with a cloth? Oh my gosh!
Did you wipe the emails? Yeah, with a cloth.
Yeah.
So I had a couple for Trump actually. So one of the people that Trump pardoned a couple people that were were in some situations during the Afghan war that and in Iraq and everything. They kind of had some questionable circumstances. Whether there was one guy that had ordered some of his soldiers to fire on and to kill some Afghani men that were sitting by a motorcycle, and they weren't hostile supposedly, and then so there's kind of all this questionable stuff that went on, that they were court-martialed immediately when it happened, but there was a bunch of other extenuating circumstances. One of the ones was Eli Gallagher. He allegedly stabbed a 17-year-old ISIS detainee, so it was somebody that they had captured one of these ISIS guys. He stabbed him, and then he took a picture of himself in front of the corpse and texted it to his buddy and said, "I got him with my hunting knife."
Don't ever take a picture with a corpse.
and so it was like, I mean, yeah, that's maybe I don't know what the whole situation was, but he was basically just, I guess, boasting that he had killed this guy, but he was an ISIS insurgent, and so there was all these questions about, well, was he detained before or after he stabbed him, and all there's those questionable stuff. So Trump pardoned him.
Speaking of kind of the same thing, I've heard about I've actually heard several stories recently about soldiers posting pictures with their dead, with the bodies of the people that they've killed, and them being just totally disowned by that. There was I think a French sniper one time who shot a guy from over a mile away, and then he it was like one of the longest shots ever taken. And then they went and flew over there and he took pictures with the dead bodies. And it was like, hey, we don't do that. And so it wasn't recognized as a further kill shot because he did that.
Yeah,
that's a story that I've heard. I don't know if that's true or not. But
interesting. No, I definitely agree. I think there's been, don't do that. Right?
There's terrorist type activity.
Yeah, there's been people that have
that's jihadi John type activity.
Yeah, there was stuff where they were in some soldiers were in a firefight and they had the enemy had killed some of our U.S. guys and they ended up killing all of the other side, and then they ended up going and like peeing on the corpses of the enemy, or our guys did, and somebody was filming it, and like all those guys got
court-martialed
for doing that.
That's weird.
Yeah, and so it's just
I can't speak how I would react in that kind of environment. If someone killed
my buddy, my best friend,
I'd be
it's like
too.
Literally.
So you can shoot them, but you can't pee on them.
Yeah, I don't know.
I don't know.
Okay, so another one that I had that I thought was interesting was, and this was from Trump as well. So Trump actually pardoned Susan B. Anthony while he was in office. So this was like 1800s Susan B. Anthony that was one of the pivotal people that were partaking in, or that were during the women's suffrage movement of women being able to vote. So in 1872, she actually voted in secret as a woman, but she voted, and she was captured and fined during that time, and she like refused to pay the fine and all this other kind of stuff. Well, Trump actually ended up in his while he was in president, he pardoned her, but it was kind of controversial because people were saying, "Oh, by him pardoning her, that is basically acknowledging that what she did was wrong," and saying,
How is a pardon?
I know, but they're saying it's almost like that she shouldn't need a pardon because what she did wasn't wrong. And so many people are saying that what she did was not wrong, so she did not need a pardon. So by Trump pardoning her, that it was like he was saying, oh, well, what she did was wrong, but I'm going to pardon her anyway. And so many people got, especially some of these like the feminists and kind of
that doesn't make any sense because the definition of a pardon is that it erases that guilt. It makes it as if it's basically acknowledging that the law was wrong in the first place.
Yeah, but the layman doesn't know that. The layman doesn't. The layman just thinks,
they should listen to our podcast then.
They're just thinking, oh, they're going to forgive somebody for wrongdoing. Well, I mean,
so that basically, what I said earlier, so that in the pardon is done, so that in the eye of the law, the offender is as innocent as if he or she in this case had never committed the offense.
Yeah. Well, maybe we should have had this podcast 3 years ago.
That's what we were talking about earlier when we were talking about the draft dodgers. Or no, we were talking about marijuana and if people who are still in jail. So it's like if someone is in jail still today for voting prior, it's like
before women were allowed to vote.
Would we still hold them in prison, or would we recognize, hey, that law was bad, you're pardoned, like you're free?
Yeah. Or is it that you broke that law when it was a law and you still have to pay the time? I don't know. But
well, if the laws are bad, that's I would say that's only under the assumption that our laws are the highest of high and they can never be wrong. Because I think if you have that mentality that the laws of the land are like golden laws of God, then you get into a space where it's like, well, they broke the law, I guess. It's like, well, the laws can change. Like, I think, and there are bad things that the laws allow. Just because the laws allow it doesn't mean you should do it. And there are things that the law doesn't allow. So we can't necessarily, we can't look at the laws for a moral compass.
Yeah, that's a good way of saying it. I had one more. If you had another.
No, I didn't have any more.
So the last one that I had, I thought was kind of interesting. That so the whole like Watergate, Richard Nixon scandal, where he had supposedly hired some people to go into the Democratic building and destroy some documents, and the whole Forrest Gump thing. Where there's like there's guys with flashlights over there.
Someone's gonna.
So basically,
he was like wiretapping their offices, Democratic.
Yeah, he was doing all kinds of stuff, and withholding information, I don't understand everything that happened with it, but it was fishy, right? And so facing the threat of impeachment from the Watergate scandal, Richard Nixon resigned on August 20th of 1974. Mm-hmm. And when he resigned, so he resigned so he wouldn't be impeached.
Yeah.
So he resigned, and his vice president, Gerald Ford, took the presidency office. And a month later, Gerald Ford, basically the whole nation was shocked when he announced, I'm going to fully pardon Richard Nixon. And
for what, though?
For basically, he pardoned him preliminarily. Because he was under indictment, and he was it
was pre-impeachment. So it says in the Constitution you can't pardon from impeachment. That's accepting in one.
Well, he wasn't actually impeached. I mean, he stepped down, and so Congress was actually preparing to investigate him, and there was some obstruction of justice charges that were already in place on him. And but Gerald Ford decided that it would only further polarize the country if he potentially went to prison, and so his vice president a month later just pardoned any of those obstruction charges that were outstanding and said, no, that's not a big deal. And then basically Congress just gave up. They were just like, okay.
Interesting
whatever.
how far we've come, and he was wiretapping some Democratic headquarters offices. And people were out for blood. And then literally the Clintons pay an ex-spy to write up a dossier to give to the FBI. Then the FBI used the Patriot Act to get a FISA warrant to tap Trump.
All of Trump and everything
Trump's
else.
Stuff.
And it was all falsified
and it was all
from the beginning.
Fake from the beginning. That was Obama, too, that was doing that.
Yeah.
And he approved that. And nothing ever happened to that.
Yeah, well,
we live in crazy times, man.
Yeah, we do.
Anyway, this episode is supposed to come out around President's Day, so
kind of cool. There's been some great pardons, some great presidents that have done some great things. There's also been some fishy instances,
but there's been some mercy too.
Yeah, I think that's a huge part of it.
Yeah, so. Anyway, it's just part of. I think Alexander Hamilton is probably doing somersaults in his grave right now with some of these things that are coming out and the way some of these things are being done. But I think that he could foresee things like the Civil War and how that was a needed thing to mend the nation. I think the Buchanan pardon of the Mormons was a critical part about expanding West. That unity needed to happen.
Yeah, Western expansion for the whole country.
Yeah,
as a whole.
So there's been some good out of it, but there's also been some shadiness.
Yeah.
So
all right. Well, if you like this episode, leave us a comment. Leave us a like.
Follow us on Instagram,
review.
And we usually post some pictures and some interesting stuff. So
yeah.
Love
all right.
to
Well,
share with you.
everyone out there, let's build our creed together.
Let's do it.